que tu creasti pectora.
Hello, my name is Joseph Wood. I'm one of the regular faculty at the Tertio Millennio Seminar in Krakow, and I'm glad to be here to try to give you a taste of Krakow, or at least one small slice of what we talk about there at the seminar. I'm always very grateful to George Weigel, to Stephen White, and now to Natalie Robertson for organizing the seminar. I started teaching 3 or 4 years ago in Krakow, and it took me a while to realize just how wonderful the seminar really is. It is comprehensively designed and thought out to be an opportunity for real spiritual engagement and growth, for intellectual engagement and growth, and most of all for real friendship in the best possible sense of friendship, the Aristotelian sense of wishing each other well mutually, wishing the best for each other, learning from each other, and in fact becoming friends, people who see each other as another self, someone to help them along and become more a person, more fully human, more virtuous, better, an all-around happier human being. And the seminar really manages to do that. It's a big project, but it is one that they succeed in every year, and I'm always glad to be part of it. It's disappointing not to be with you in person. I'm sure you're all accustomed to Zoom meetings and distance learning much more than I am. But the realities of this year made that necessary, and I hope that this taste will be some encouragement for you to join the seminar next year and to be there with us when a taste of the Tertio Millennio Seminar really becomes the real thing, the full thing, because I promise you a great experience and something that you'll remember forever. Every year, the group comes together, develops a real community, and then parts, but you never part quite the same, and you're always aware that there are some people in the world that you may never speak to again. You probably keep in touch with some people, but you'll never speak with others again, and you know that there are people out there who have learned the way that you have and have become part of what you are, and you become part of what they are as you move on. With that, let me talk a little bit about the taste of the seminar that I hope to talk about, which is politics. In particular, the distinction between the ancient or classical understanding of politics and the modern understanding of politics. I want to begin by referring to another lecture that you've hopefully watched or that you'll have available, the lecture of Dr. Russ Hittinger on the 3 necessary societies. The 3 societies that we need to have in order to really thrive as human beings. And those 3 societies are the family, the political community, and the church, the ecclesial society. You notice in each one of those societies, what's important is a series of relationships. Those societies I want you to keep in mind as we focus on the political community, the political society, and the kind of political society, the nature of the political society that's necessary for us as people to thrive. The ancients had something to say about this. The moderns have something to say about this. And I'm going to try in a very, very short period of time to draw the distinctions and the connections between those two. And again, this is just a taste, just a lead-in to what we talk about at the seminar and what we talk about in other fora as well. Questions that have endured since people began thinking about why it was that they seemed to come together, why they wanted to do things together. What Pierre Menant, the French political philosopher, has called the common operation. Why do we have to do this together? Why is it we can't just go off and be on our alone by ourselves? Why do we have to operate towards some common good in order to be fully human? So I'll begin again by talking a little bit about the ancient understanding of political community, what it was all about, why it was necessary. And I'll begin about the time of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, the 3 great philosophers of ancient Athens. Important as we look at our headlines to remember that they were writing at a time of enormous political instability. They were thinking through problems created by civil war, war with other cities. And they were thinking about the particular position and what they could learn from what they looked at right around them, which was the city of Athens. Now, Plato describes in his dialogues the thinking of his teacher Socrates. At least some of his dialogues do that. Others don't mention Socrates in particular, and there's a lot of debate among scholars about whether Plato in those other dialogues is really relating Socrates or his own thoughts or what exactly he's up to. But I want to talk briefly about two of those dialogues today, very briefly, and see what they tell us about the classical understanding of politics. And it was Plato and Aristotle, really Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, who brought that understanding out in a way that's been studied now for 23 or 2400 years. We need to get the dates right just to make sure we know where we are and when we are. We're in Athens. Socrates lived from 469 to 399 BC. His student Plato lived from 427 to 347 BC, so right around 300 BC for Plato. And Aristotle, the student of Plato, lived around 384 to 322. Aristotle was not actually Athenian. He was Macedonian. He was at one time in his life the tutor of Alexander the Great. Now let me interject here that I know that many of you are very familiar with this ground. And so I hope you'll find it a useful review and able to enable you to put these thoughts in the context of what the other lectures at the seminar are discussing. The first thing I want to mention just briefly, the first dialogue I want to mention is Plato's Gorgias. In that dialogue, Socrates has a conversation with three rhetoricians, teachers of rhetoric, who believe that the most important thing in the world is to exercise power over others through the use of language, rhetoric. Socrates, as you can imagine, doesn't have much time for this. And the dialogue unfolds with two key themes. One is rhetoric, which is to say, what is the role of speech in how we understand reality, how we understand what is. One of the great projects of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, all the ancients, is to make their speech match reality. Make their words say what is true about reality. Now there we already have an important insight. There is a reality that language should describe. The rhetoricians are not concerned with that. They're concerned with getting what they want, being able to exile the people that they want, being able to take the property of the people whose property they want, being able to execute people they don't want in the city. So there's a very different point of view here between a nature, a moral order of things that speech should seek and reveal through dialectic, in the case of dialogues, questioning back and forth, and another view that says those are not the important things. What's important is me, what I want, and what I'm out to get. Am I getting those things? Now Socrates says something almost in passing. For those of you who are Plato scholars or fans of Plato, this comes at Stephanus number right around Stephanus number 464b in the Gorgias. And Socrates says, I say that such a thing exists in body and soul, which makes the body and the soul seem to be in good condition, but they nonetheless are not. He's talking about health. There's something in the body which is real health, and there's something that simulates health, pretends to be health. In the political terms of getting towards justice, which is what rhetoric should really do, it will be that rhetoric disconnected from justice is kind of like cookery or flattery. It's just kind of a nothing. But rhetoric connected to justice will help bring about the true health of the body, of the soul. The science that deals with the body is medicine. And the fake science that might go along with that is cookery that just makes things appealing, appetizing. Then he says something that's very striking, and it's almost hard to imagine as we look at our headlines today, as we look at what's going on in the world, in our country, in the U.S. And he says, Socrates says, now then, if I can, I shall more clearly display to you what I'm saying. There are two kinds of business. I say there are two arts. The one directed to the soul, the health of the soul, I call politics. The one directed to the body, I am unable to name for you in this way, but I say that while the care of the body is one, it has two parts, gymnastic and medicine. So we have immediately the notion of Plato's idea that the body and the soul are separate, often referred to as Plato's dualism. But we have a little bit more startlingly the idea that the health of the soul is closely related to politics. And this will be a key theme in ancient politics, in the ancient understanding of political community. The soul and the city, the political community, are intimately related. They go together. The soul cannot be good without a good political community, at least fully good. And the political community cannot be good without citizens whose souls are good. And that takes me into a second dialogue, Plato's most famous dialogue, that I want to discuss very, very briefly. I mentioned that the themes in the Gorgias were rhetoric and justice. Justice being righteousness, rightness in accord with what is, with the moral order of things that we don't get to choose, we don't get to make up for ourselves. And the Republic is also centrally concerned with justice. In fact, all of politics is ultimately concerned with justice. Rightness, what is. In the dialogue, The Republic, Socrates is talking with a different group of friends, and they have a question for him. Their question is, what is justice? We hear a lot about it. We don't know what it is. And maybe more importantly, we don't even know why it should be that we should try to live just lives. We look around and the people who are attempting to live with justice, in justice, as just people, don't seem to do any better than the people who are unconcerned with justice. Why is it, Socrates, his friends say, that we should concern ourselves with these things? And first, what is justice? Tell us what it is. And Socrates plays a little trick, if you will. It's an honest trick. But he tells his friends, I'll try to answer that question for you. But to understand justice, we can't just look at the person. The person is very small. And we won't be able to see what justice is. We won't be able to see it come about or arise or make it visible within a small thing like a person. So to understand justice, we're going to look at something very big. We'll look at a city. That's what's around us all the time, so we'll look at the city. And if we can figure out what justice is in the city, in the political community, then it'll be pretty easy to bring it back to justice in the individual, and we can start to figure out what that's all about. And his friends say, that's fine. What do you have to say about justice in the city? And Socrates says, well, let me describe the just city for you. In this just city, people come together because they want to do things together. Things they might not be able to do by themselves. And people have different jobs. There's what in modern terms we might call diversity of labor. Jobs are divided, but there aren't that many jobs. Most people are farmers, most people are fishermen, most people are herders. And then there are a few other people who supply those basic occupations. But the important thing about each person's job, each person's role in the economy, is that that person fills that job by nature, by the nature of what he or she is. He, in the case of Athens, for the most part. If a person is supposed to be a farmer by his essence, by his nature, that's what he should be in this just city that Socrates is describing. All right, so we now know that there are different people with different jobs, a few. There are going to be a small number of traders, merchants, and there will be a few people who have to go out to other cities to buy things from other cities that we can't get ourselves, says Socrates, but that's a pretty small number. And these people in this city live a life that we might describe as one where they are content. Their needs are met. They have enough food. They don't have a lot of food, an enormous amount of food. They have about what it takes to get by, and a little bit more. They're not starving. It's not just a subsistence life, but it's certainly not lavish. They have enough clothes to get by. They have a basic, modest kind of a house. They have a little bit of religion, a little bit of ritual that satisfies our need to have some kind of ritual that's somehow oriented towards something bigger than ourselves, bigger than our city. And they have some wine, maybe. They can lie on the hearth in front of the fire at night and be satisfied and content with what they've done that day as farmers or herders or whatever their job is by nature. And this living, this existence can go on forever and ever. It can go on indefinitely. generation after generation. And Socrates says, there you are, that's the just city. And his friends say, wait a minute, that's not a just city. What you've described is not a city for people, it's a city for pigs. We want much more than what you've just described. We want all different kinds of food and spices. We want different clothes. We want different poetry. We want different drama. We want all the entertainments. We want lots and lots of things. And Socrates says, wait a minute. That's not what you asked me to do. You asked me to describe the just city. I gave you the healthy city, he says. What you're proposing is a fevered city, fevered by its own wants and desires. And Socrates says, well, let's go on with this anyway. Nevertheless, it might be worth doing. And so he proceeds to describe how we might get back to the healthy city, the just city. In the city that he's going to describe in the Republic, he describes three different classes of people. The first are the guardians, because this city wants more and more. It has to expand, and it will always encounter other cities, and there will be war. So one of the first phenomena we get in politics that we have to deal with is warfare. And the guardians of the city will be those who are trained, well, the most talented, the most virtuous, the most capable of all the citizens, who will put the city first before themselves. Their only interest will be that of the city as a whole. They won't have children of their own. They may have children, but the children will be raised in common. They'll eat meals together. They won't have any private property. They will have nothing to get in the way of their devotion to the good of the city. They are completely given to the defensive needs and services of this city that now has greater wants and needs that are going to provoke war. Their virtue, obviously, is courage. They will need the thumos of the spirit of the soul to be guided by courage so that they can survive in combat and defend the city successfully. Then the question becomes, who's going to rule this city? And he describes the Philosopher Kings. From the guardians, there will be drawn those who have the capacity for true wisdom, knowledge of the highest causes of things, what makes things happen. Those are the people with this high divine understanding of the causes of things who should rule. Their virtue is wisdom. And then finally, there's a third group beneath this, the first two, if you will. And they are those who are simply trying to get through life. They want a little bit more. They might want a nicer house. They might want a nicer set of clothes. They might want a little more food. But their concern is basically their appetites. What is it they want? They want to gain what makes them pleased, what gets them pleasure, and they want to avoid what gives them pain. And these people are necessary. They make up most of the city. They are the ones who will be, in a sense, the life of the city, but they aren't concerned with higher things, and they aren't virtuous in the way that the guardians are. Their virtue, because they are mainly appetitive, they're about their appetites, their virtue is moderation, to pursue their appetites in moderation as necessary for the good of the city. And Socrates says the essence of justice in the city is that these three groups, the Philosopher Kings, the guardians, which he later calls the auxiliaries, and the appetitive classes, the economic classes, all live in harmony with each other. No one gets out of line. The Philosopher Kings don't suddenly say, well, I'm going to quit and go be a farmer. The guardians don't suddenly say, I want to be a philosopher king. I think I'm smarter than they are. The appetitive classes don't suddenly decide they want to be philosopher kings based on their experience as farmers. And Socrates says it's the harmony among these three groups of the city that really produces justice, that is justice in the city. And then he can come back to the original question to his friends and say, what is justice for the individual? Well, it's a three-part problem as well, a three-part understanding of the human soul and justice. In the human soul, the well-ordered soul, like the well-ordered city, reason rules. Reason is what's in charge. In the middle is the spirit of the person, which has to be guided by reason, with the virtue of courage, to act when is necessary, to refrain from action when action is not right, and finally moderation of the appetites of the soul. Socrates says this kind of city that I've described would never actually exist, only in speech. But it's the only kind of city that a truly wise man, a real philosopher, not like the fake philosophers who are out there, would ever agree to be part of. And then Socrates also spends a good bit of time in the Republic thinking about the different kinds of cities that are out there. And he introduces an early version of what we might call regime analysis, an understanding of the kinds of regimes that rule cities. And he just divides, both here and in a separate dialogue, a third dialogue, The Statesman, he divides cities as ruled by the one, the few, or the many. Now, Aristotle is going to pick up that notion and in his book, The Politics, discuss again the nature of the political community. What is it about the political community that's important? What is it that's true? What can we say about it? How can our speech describe correctly what we see going on around us in politics, in the political community? Aristotle says, as almost an axiom, that men, people, are rational and political by nature. We are unique among the animals in our reason, and we are political in the sense that by nature, we have to be involved in a common operation, a common good with others, in order to thrive, in order to be something like happy, or as happy as we can be in this life. In the Nicomachean Ethics, he explains that our telos, what we're really built for, is happiness. And he says the way that we can actually get to that, the only way we can get close to that, we never get to it perfectly in this life, because we can't be all contemplatives all the time, is to participate in politics with virtue. Man is a political and a rational animal, and he says that this occurs by nature. We are political by nature, by the essence of what we are. And if we are not political, and again, I'm not talking about out running for office or getting headlines or at a political convention, I'm talking about political in the sense of working towards a common good. If we are not that kind of political, then we must be either a god or a beast. We're not human. It is so much a part of us to be political that someone who lacks this is not really human. It's what we are. And he then describes a series of natural relationships through which politics comes into existence. The first is man and woman, for the procreation of the species, the telos, or the for what, the sake of, the why is it that we have such a relationship of man and woman is procreation of the species, continuation of the species. He also talks master and slave, very difficult discussion in Aristotle, in which he seems to say, to me at least, that there are bad forms of slavery, where people are forcibly and wrongly put under slavery, but there's a form which looks more natural, which I would describe as dependent and independent. People who can make decisions and then others helping them with their bodily labor to implement those decisions. Those relationships all come together as a household. Household is large enough, sufficient enough, diverse enough to survive on a daily basis. It provides all that you need. It's self-sufficient for life on a daily basis. Then, as a few households come together, they can do more and more together and they become a village, until finally a series of villages come together and they become a city. The city exists, says Socrates, not merely for the sake of living, although it does exist for that so that we can all live, but for the sake of living well, of pursuing a common good, of pursuing noble things, good things, beyond what each of these other natural relationships can do. And none of those early relationships, the family, the household, or the village, can be what it is supposed to be unless the city, this final community, the political community, is what it is supposed to be. That's where we have to be in order to thrive. And that's what politics is intended to be. Now, just very briefly, I said I would mention the modern distinction between this kind of politics. For several hundreds and thousands of years, we had the brief introduction of Cicero in Rome, who translates the Greek philosophers and brings them into Latin, and talks a great deal about natural law, the idea that there is a moral order to things that Aristotle had begun to develop, that Socrates and Plato had begun to think about. But after Cicero, living in the century before Christ, as Rome is transitioning from being a city of somewhat virtuous nature to a republic, we get from then until around 1500 no new real political philosophy. It's a long time. A lot of political disorder with the fall of the Roman Empire, and nothing comes to replace it as the nation begins to arise, and arises as a result of force presented by the church with its demands for one way to live, and by secular rulers who, Christian though they may be, want their own prerogatives as rulers. And then around 1500, we begin to see some changes in political philosophy, beginning with Machiavelli. Writes a famous book called The Prince. And in Machiavelli, or in The Prince, Machiavelli does some very important things. He says, first of all, that this whole notion of Christian thinking about politics that we've tried to work with and use to guide ourselves for the last 1500 years has not worked. All we see is total chaos. And he's looking at an Italy that is in chaos. No political order, violence, disorder. And he says we need a different approach because we want to have some kind of peace. And he says, let's quit thinking about this idea of common good. And so Machiavelli, unlike those who had come before him, Cicero and Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, really almost jettisons the idea of good as a consideration in politics. The strongest idea of good that comes up in The Prince is the idea that the people who are out with very simple needs and wants just don't want to be oppressed by the powerful. He's very sympathetic with that. But he also argues that princes must maintain power, and he argues that we don't have a lot of control over what goes on around us. Most things that happen are by fate, and the real definition of virtue is not this stuff about wisdom or courage or moderation that was talked about in ancient virtue understanding, but real virtue is overwhelming fate. He even says fate is like a woman, and we have to overtake her, we have to overcome her, we have to ravish her. And so the notion of power and fear becomes central in politics as people begin to think about it. Now, the other father of modern political philosophy is generally thought to be Thomas Hobbes, who does something rather similar. He introduces the idea of a state of nature in which there's only war of all against all. There's no political order whatsoever. Each of us in the state of nature has a right to defend his or her own life. One simple right. And then slowly, according to his notions of natural law, we should try to come together to create a contract and come out of the state of nature. That's going to require an extremely powerful government, the Leviathan, which will ensure that we don't fall back into the state of nature. But again, the fundamental notion of politics under Hobbes, and I'm simplifying enormously here, is the idea that the purpose of politics is to escape fear. Hobbes even said that when his mother gave birth to him, she gave birth to twins, Hobbes himself in fear. And so the notion of good, the notion of a common understanding of good, a very hard to capture, very hard to work out, but nevertheless essential idea of a common good, which involves friendship, gives way in modern politics to the avoidance of fear. And then there are a lot more developments after that. Now, I want to close that very brief introduction with a quotation from a terrific article by Father Thomas Joseph White, a Dominican thinker. This is an article that comes from First Things. It's called The Metaphysics of Democracy by Thomas Joseph White, and it was in the February 2018 volume or issue of First Things. And White argues that we need to go back certainly to an understanding of politics that is more in line with thinkers like Socrates and Aristotle, who were concerned with metaphysics, with very basic truths, with the being of being. And another thinker that I wanted to close with, and just this is an allusion to that thinker, who believes that and who develops it importantly, is St. Augustine in his work, The City of God. And if there's one work that I could recommend you spend some time on this summer, it's City of God. You can start with book 19. It's an enormously long book, but you can start with book 19. You can go back to book 1. But it's an extremely important book, both for what it says about Christianity and about politics, and what it says about history as a whole, how politics is important, what is politics in the unfolding of history. And Father Thomas White, in his First Things article on the metaphysics of democracy, says, in fact, the great political theology of our age should be that of Augustine in the City of God. The Church neither conforms to the world artificially nor retreats from the world. Instead, she bears witness across time in every age to the perennial truths that endure, the dogmas of the Church, principles of metaphysical realism, the ethical norms of human virtue and happiness. These, says Father Thomas White, are what we have to keep our eye on when we think of politics. And these are what in the actual seminar we spend a good deal more time on. Father White goes on, this stance does not produce historical revolution, but a continual consideration of the metaphysics of the things that remain. God is our eschaton, our final cause, our final place, our final being, not the profane aims of the Gentile nations. The future, he says, belongs to the tribe that can articulate correctly the human orientation towards transcendence that cannot be eradicated and that remains at the heart of modernity, and especially at the heart of modern democracy. St. John Henry Newman was right to see in modern liberalism a theological adversary. Today we need to formulate a Catholic view of democracy that is not based on the dogmas of liberalism. Our task is to challenge the premises of Kant and rediscover the basic claim of Aristotle. First philosophy is not politics or ethics, it's metaphysics. And that is an important thing to think about in the seminar and throughout all of your thinking about politics, about the three necessary societies, the family, the political community, and the church, and throughout all your lives. Now, I'm certainly at the end of my time, having marched you through a series of thinkers whose work requires lifetime to study, not just a few seconds here and there. But I did want to offer one personal reflection in the hopes of ensuring that you will apply to and try to get to the seminar next summer. When we found out this year the seminar was canceled, it was very, very disappointing. And I was thinking about all the things that I would be missing in the seminar. A lot of things leapt out at me, the students themselves meeting you, the conversations that we have, the teaching in the aula, the auditorium, Krakow itself, the beautiful city that I just never get tired of, the trips from Krakow to see the home of John Paul II, to see Sister Faustina's church, to see the mountains, these wonderful, wonderful places that never get old, that are wonderful to visit. Those were on my mind. The wonderful meals that were, the delicious food in Krakow, all these things that were, I'll miss, that I won't have this summer, that have really become a part of my life. But then one thing popped into my mind that I had not expected. I wouldn't have listed it initially. Most evenings, the group goes out to dinner together. And it's at the end of the day, obviously. And the group gathers in a courtyard, the courtyard of the place where we stay and where we have our meetings. And in the courtyard, as people come together, they've just been to Mass, probably heard a good homily from Father de Souza. And they are starting to mingle and get together for the evening. The real intellectual work of the day is behind us, and now there's going to be a lot of intellectual conversation as well, but good, friendly conversation as well. And people are just invariably, it seems to me, in that courtyard, 6 o'clock, 6:15, in a good mood. Stephen White's always trying to organize us to get us to head out, walking through the beautiful city of Krakow to some delicious restaurant, anticipating food. And I realized that moment, that coming together after the day's intellectual effort, after the spiritual center of the day at Mass, and after all that we've been through, all that the community has grown into, is anticipating this wonderful banquet, this feast that we're going to have together. So next year, for our some time in Krakow, I hope that with this taste of the Tertio Millennium Seminar, I've given you some reason to think that you want to be there in that courtyard with us. And until then, I wish you all the best.